In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace your front strut on your Ford Taurus. It's located behind your front wheel. Using a 19mm socket, we'll take off our lug nuts. Make sure you keep a hand on it for that last one. All right, we're going to use a 29mm socket, and we're going to undo our axle nut. All right, so now to take off this washer, you're going to use a magnet. Easiest way. So using a 10mm socket, I'm using a swivel with an extension. I'm going to undo my brake hose bracket. You can just let that flop to the side. Using an 18mm wrench on the head of the bolt and a 21mm socket on the nut of the bolt. We're going to take this out. I'm going to thread my nut back on a little bit so that I can tap it out. I'm going to put that on a little bit more so that I don't mushroom out the nut. I'm going to use my piece of wood, and I'm going to try to bang it out a little bit. Just get it to move. That's the goal. Make sure your brake hose isn't in the way, if you also have to do this. Our vehicle's kind of rusty, so that's why. Kind of separate this knuckle a little bit on the strut so we can slide the knuckle up on the strut. So I'm using a chisel, cold chisel in between the pinch area. I'm also trying to get the bolt to move a little. Using a pry bar. Use a piece of wood and a sledgehammer after you put your nut on that stud. All right, once you start seeing that axle start to move, you know it's free. All right, so I'm going to use some rust penetrant to get this knuckle to slide up and down on the strut. Use my sledgehammer. All right, so I'm using an 18mm socket and a pry bar to get this bolt out. So you're going to use some wire cutters. Undo your cotter pin. Might use a pick. Shake it around if your car's rusty like this. Rust typically doesn't like the shakes. I'm not cutting it off, I'm just pulling it out with these. All right, so now we're going to use a 17mm socket to take off our castle nut. Okay, so now you want to whack it right here. Just don't hit your fingers on that, that would hurt. I have my nut on the bottom of the tie rod so I can go like that if needed. Okay, so that's free, so we're going to take our nut off. And pull it out. Using a 21mm socket and my air gun, I'm going to take this bottom nut off the ball joint. So I'm using this tool to separate the lower control arm from the ball joint. I'm going to put my lug nut on to hold it in place. So using an 18mm socket, we're going to disconnect the top part of the sway bar link. Looks like we have it spinning, so I'm going to use locking pliers on the other end just to hold the inside still as I get this nut off. All right, so this has given us quite a trouble getting off, so I had to heat it up. And now I'm just holding it on the back side with some locking pliers and using my air gun on it. It's inching off slowly. Hopefully you don't have this trouble at home. Okay, it's off. It's just so hot that I can't touch it. So I'm gonna leave it there and let it cool off. All right, so I'm gonna use a rag to get this nut off. I'm gonna put that on the ground. And now we can take out our sway bar link. So you're gonna use a 15mm socket with a swivel to get to these caliper bolts. Make sure you don't let that caliper fall. A good place to stick this is probably over on your disconnected tie rod. Make sure you don't kink your brake hose. Just make sure it's out of the way when you're prying down to get the knuckle off of the strut. All right, so now let's take our lug nut off so we can get our rotor off. Now we can take our rotor off. Make sure it's free. All right, so now we're gonna pry down on this. Okay, once you get your ball joint out, you can let the lower control arm pop up a little. Now, might need a little bit of a hammer. Make sure you have a good hold of that knuckle. Make sure your axle's out. So I'm pulling away and tapping it down. There you go. All right, using a 13mm socket, I'm going to take off these nuts. Take off 2 at first, and then leave the last one hanging on a thread, basically. I'm using one with a swivel to get in there, so you can grab it underneath so it doesn't fall on the ground, which I'm going to put a hand on now. Just put your hand right on that spring. All right, so now you can grab the strut and take it out. When it's time to put your strut in, you're going to want to line up your stud on the top and this bracket are all in one line, and that one goes in the far back over here. All right, once you get that nut started, you can start the other ones. And now we can snug them up. We'll torque them later. So now we're gonna put our axle in as we feed the strut through the knuckle. So you're gonna be lining up this bracket in the back with the slit in the back of the knuckle. Once you get past the axle part, things should start to go in where they need to. You're gonna need probably a helping hand to get someone to pry down on the control arm in order to get the ball joint in. If you find that your dust shield for your brakes is a little bent, you're gonna wanna put that back where it was. I'm just using some locking pliers. It does take a lot of effort getting that ball joint in that lower control arm. Kind of pry it away and put it back where it goes. All right, now that we've bent back our shield there, we're gonna put our axle nut on. Put your washer on first. Just hand tighten that for now. Using a 13mm socket, after you've hand tightened your nut, you are going to tighten it down to 184 foot-pounds. You're not going to want to use any air guns or battery-operated guns for this. You just want to crank it until it stops and then torque it to 184. I am holding my hub still, using a pry bar between 2 lug nuts and using the floor as my stopper. All right, so now we're going to torque it. So let's put our strut bolt in. You might have to tap it through. All All right, so we put our bolt through, starting the nut on the other side. I'm using a 21 millimeter long socket and my impact gun, and an 18 millimeter on the head side. And we're gonna tighten up the strut. All right, we are gonna torque this pinch bolt to 59 foot-pounds. Now you can put your ball joint nut on. So let's tighten up this ball joint nut to 59 foot-pounds. All right, so once you get your nut tight to 59 foot-pounds, you're gonna see if your cotter pin fits through. If it doesn't, you can tighten it until it does, until it lines up. Don't ever loosen it. Always tighten it to make it fit. So I'm gonna tighten mine up a tiny bit more to line up my hole better. That looks good. You're gonna feed your cotter pin through and pull that part down, and then the other one can go around. You can use your fingers to start and then lock it down with some needle nose pliers. I usually tap it up a little bit and then I cut the excess off with some wire cutters. All right, so here we are. We're gonna put our rotor back on. We're gonna spray our hub with some anti-seize. Now you can put your rotor on. I'm gonna use a lug nut to hold that on. If you find that your rotor has gotten a little dirty, you can spray it down with some brake parts cleaner. So now I'm going to put our caliper back on. I'm going to tighten down those bolts. Using a 15 millimeter socket, we are going to torque these caliper bracket bolts to 79 foot-pounds. So we're going to put our brake hose back. So you're going to line up your brake hose bracket into the strut bracket, and then you're going to use your self-threading bolt and self-thread it into the bracket. Like that. We're going to put our sway bar link into the strut bracket. Now you can put the nut on. You're going to need a Allen head, size 5 millimeter, to go inside the stud of the sway bar link, and I'm going to use an 18 millimeter ratchet wrench for the nut. So we're using an 18 millimeter socket. We're going to torque this to 66 foot-pounds. So now we're going to place our tie rod back in the knuckle. Just line up the stud to go through. And then we're going to put our castle nut on. We're going to snug this up a little bit with our gun, and then we're gonna torque it. Zip this on a little bit, and once you get it snugged, we're gonna torque it to 41 foot-pounds. And you're gonna look for your hole for your cotter pin. If it's lined up, great. If it's not, turn it towards tightening. So now we're gonna stick our cotter pin through. Mine's nice and lined up. And you wanna pull this one up and over the stud, and then this one to the side. Just get rid of those ends. You can either hammer them down, push them down, or you can cut them off if it's too long, which I'm going to do here. And that will keep that nut from falling off. We're going to use a 13 millimeter socket. and torque our upper strut mounting nuts to 26 foot-pounds. I'm going to check all the way around one more time. You're going to want to take your lug nut off. Make sure you put them on hand tight first, and you're going to tighten them in a star-like pattern using a 19mm socket. I usually do the bottom one first and walk the wheel on. Snug them up, and then we're going to be torquing them. Using a 19mm socket, we're going to torque our wheels to 95 foot-pounds. We're going to do it in a star-like pattern. I'm going to check it one more time, go all the way around. And we're good.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.